Hey, welcome back, everybody. It's another episode of the Nonprofit Show. You know, it's getting hot around this planet. It's a hot week. It's a scorcher in so many places. And we're going to have a scorching conversation because we're going to be talking about AI, but we're going to ask the question, does this really save time and where does it save time? We have two experts on the show today, and it's going to be fun because they both have good names, challenging names. And so we're going to start with Buu-Ling Tran. She's been on before. She is with the amazing team over at JMT Consulting. And then Torbjorn Nilsen is joining us. He is the Director of Business Solutions at DATABASICS. And so the three of us are going to have a really interesting look at how we should be thinking about this additional tool that's so new for so many of us in the nonprofit sector. You know, what's not new are our amazing partners. Most of these folks have been with us since the beginning of our show. We're going to be celebrating our 1600th episode. Say that fast 3 times on Friday. And these folks that have supported us along the way include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, Your Part-Time Controller, Third Sector Company, JMT Consulting, and Intuit QuickBooks. I'm Julia C. Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy, and I'm just so excited to mention to you that we have launched the Nonprofit Show Global Edition. We're taking 1 to 2 episodes a month with one of our co-hosts, Matthew Murray, who's based in England. And we're talking about international philanthropy and what that looks like and the different nuances to that. So make sure you join us. Buu-Ling Tran, as Senior Vice President of Financial Solutions, tell us what JMT is up to.
Well, there's a lot going on at JMT. And just to give you a little bit of background who we were founded back in 91, really to help nonprofits achieve their mission. We work exclusively with nonprofit organizations, and we serve over 2,300 nonprofits supporting their back office accounting operations, leveraging financial systems. We also provide accounting services as well. And just as an FYI, one of our major event that takes place annually is called Innovate. And what Innovate is, it's really a 3-day annual conference for nonprofit finance professionals where we really gather together the people, the idea, innovation, and just, sharing the knowledge and experience. It's a great way to learn. And we usually have that event in May of every year. And we just completed our last Innovate here in the DC area. We had over 300 nonprofits attend that conference. Jill, you were there as well. So you know how alive that event is. And next year, May of 2027, it's going to be held in Savannah, Georgia. So super excited about, our upcoming event.
Awesome. It's a great event. I have to tell you, I was having dinner with a speaker that I met in Boston several years ago at Innovate. He happened to be in my community of Phoenix, Arizona, and he connected with me and said, "Hey, I'm going to be in town. I haven't been to Phoenix in 20 years. Do you want to, grab a bite to eat?" And we talked about Innovate and how that was the place where we met and then, created this great bond. And so anyway, long story short, it's a great thing. Don't miss it. Torbjorn Nilsen, hey, talk to us about DATABASICS, because data is not so basic, is it?
It never was,
No.
But it catches the eyeballs. DATABASICS, we are a time and expense solutions company, and since the mid-90s, we have partnered with nonprofits of all sizes across the globe, actually, working on essentially streamlining time, expense, grant, and workforce management problems for our customers. We've been working with JMT and Buu-Ling for coming up to 10 years now. So we have been around the block a number of times. We've seen it all. And we feel that we really know what actually delivers measurable value to nonprofit organizations, protecting donor trust and funder accountability.
Okay, so I've got to believe that your heads are spinning at DATABASICS in this 10-year trajectory of where you started and now where things are given AI. I mean, it's got to be really an exciting time that we're all rethinking about how we do work, right?
It's very exciting. The data is what makes AI exciting, right? And it also gives us a little bit of concerns, and our partners are concerned about using it correctly, using it, getting value. I think in working with nonprofits, what we see is obviously what's most important is the core mission of our partner. And very often, because we're on the finance side of the house, we tend to see that we're seen as a cost, and that's fair enough. We don't bring the funds in. We understand and respect the importance of donor relationships, but you have very in many cases very strict regulations that you have to deal with. You have in terms of restriction of funds, all those kinds of things. It's important, and we feel that AI can be brought in an intelligent way for our customers in order to help control and help take away some of these burdens that are put on them.
It's such an interesting way to think about AI as a tool. And, it's coming up almost every show, and the nonprofit show, it's entering into the conversation and in so many different ways, right? So many different avenues to approach using AI. And I keep using the word tool. Let's talk about something that you touched on, Torbjorn, and that is compliance. How should we look at this tool and understanding how we can be more compliant and working more intelligently, safely?
Yeah, I think AI, generally speaking, there is a huge amount of nervousness, not just in Europe, but maybe driven from Europe, where there's privacy concerns is a major driver for a lot of our customers. But these are concerns across the globe. What happens to my data, right? And so when we speak about AI and we speak about the value that AI brings, what we want to also make sure is that we're safeguarding the privacy of that data, that we're not bringing that data, that is your data, into the world. It becomes a part of the World Wide Web, so to speak, that you control that as a customer, and that you feel comfortable in the fact that we are then the stewards of your data, right, as a service provider. Very important for us. Now, as it comes to those regulatory requirements, these are taking a lot of effort, I think, for our customers in terms of controlling, auditing, and a lot of this is very repetitive, very monotonous. There are things that are ripe for automation. And so it's striking that balance, making sure that you can safeguard your data, but also be more efficient in the way that you operate in the finance space. That is really taking up a lot of our focus these days at DATABASICS.
Buu-Ling, do you see that your clients, and you have such a vast array of clients across this country, are they understanding some of the points that Torbjorn brought up? Like, are they concerned about the security of their data? Are they understanding what's at risk here?
I think that AI is still very new, and in terms of people's understanding of AI is also, it varies across different clients. I think that some have brought up questions about compliance, security, those type of questions. And some don't even bring it up. And that's because it's still very new, sort of out there. And I think that while AI is important, I think that at the end of the day, these are tools to help bring efficiencies. And for some organizations, or I should say, there's still a lot of organizations out there that are really doing things very manual. And yes, AI can help, but I think I've always said, look at the basics first. To looking at tools that help you streamline your operations. I think that's the key here. Having AI helps, but AI is ultimately not the reason to do certain things. It's really looking at your operations and improving it. If AI is in the mix, great. And if you find a solutions where, you know, they may not be using AI, but they are, but that solution is helping you meet your needs, that's something to, you know, to look into and think about.
Yeah. You know, that's a really good strategic approach, right? Don't just jump onto this because that's what the cool kids are doing. I mean, more
Exactly.
to think about what's the more strategic aspect, and to Torbjorn's point, what is safe, secure, and ethical, right? Which I
Mhm.
think we're just still in the infancy of this discussion. I mean,
Yeah.
things are continuing to change. Let's talk about another piece that you both seem to really think that we can be looking at using AI, and how it can highlight potential issues and where anomalies might occur. Give us a picture of what that might look like. How should we be thinking about this? Torbjorn, you go ahead and
Sure.
start.
Okay. Yeah. So you know, we do time and expense reporting. So the end user facing part of this process, and what we are doing is, of course, the end user, we are really helping them do the accounting right on the front end. And some of the time, most of the time, because we create intuitive solutions, they get it right. But some of the times they don't. Now, I think there's a misconception a little bit about what AI is and what it can do. A lot of the things that people talk about as AI today is really automations that we have had in our system since day one. You know, we are recognizing things and we see patterns. What AI kind of brings on top of that is they can look for the anomalies. They can, by searching for patterns in the raw data, actually bring things to light. As an example, you know, one of the things that is potentially a problem in expense reporting is alcohol, and expensing that alcohol consumption, either for for idealistic purposes, or even funding. You know, government funding says alcohol is an unallowable cost. AI, we are using successfully today to not just read the receipt and see, you know, how much was it and was it within the guidelines of the organization, but it can itemize that receipt, and it can recognize alcohol brand names, and it can say, you know, we see this Sam Adams beer here. Is it part of the expense?
Right.
And you know, some organizations said that's okay, and they have a policy that says no alcohol, but they don't have a policy that says no Sam Adams, right? And so that's the type of things that would have used a human eye in the past to identify something that's an outlier in the process, and which now can be taken away from them, and they can focus on controlling, because that's the thing that I think a lot of people are afraid of, is losing control. I think it's super important that nonprofits stay in control of their data and their processes.
Yeah. Buu-Linh, this is a really interesting aspect because it's so granular. And yet, if you get it wrong, you can really mess up a lot of things along the journey to being a good steward of funds, grant application, grant relationships, just certainly your accounting team. How do you see this? Are you seeing that same type of an issue with highlighting these problems?
Well, I think that you know, we're all learning about AI, and if you're, you know, sort of referring to like anomaly, things like that, some of that risk, I think that you have to keep in mind that this thing is also learning, right? And it learns only based on what kind of data, right, that is in the systems.
Yeah.
And so it's, you know, some of the things I've heard from clients is like, you know, it may not always do what you want it to do, right? Because data is not perfect. You know, data could be messy, and yet you have this AI that's looking at your data, right? And so what I always say is that it does take time, and hopefully, if there is a pattern, let's just say coding being an example, a lot of times they say, well, AI is looking at your data and trying to find a pattern so they can even code it for you, right? You don't have to think about it, right? But that's what we say, and that's what a lot of publishers say, but it all depends on, well, how good is your data, at the end of the day.
Yeah, I love that you said that, because that's a good level set, understanding kind of where we are and where we need to be going. Along that line, let's talk about those repetitive tasks. When we think about AI, and that's one of the things that we keep hearing, oh, it's going to save time. It's going to save time. But what is a repetitive task? I would like to hear from both of you. Give us some examples of what that looks like, because it seems to me in the nonprofit world, no 2 days are the same. In many ways, we're always bouncing back and forth. So help us to understand what might be a task that is something that we can move over to AI. Buu-Ling, I'll have you go first. Help us understand that.
Number one is data entry.
Okay. I didn't think.
I mean, no one likes. I would say data entry is sort of like the grunt work. Especially when you're dealing with expense reports. It's high volume. Receipts, things like that. It's high volume. And it's grunt work, and it's boring, and it's mindless. So this is where I think AI definitely shines, and can just take that work directly off, people's plate. Data entry. I think any other manual. The other thing I've seen with AI, just in general, is the ability to produce reports. Now, no one wants to learn how to create reports. Who wants to learn how to, like, oh, what data do I need? Where do I pull it? And every system is different, and so I'm starting to see where you're basically telling the system in English, right? In English, where it can interpret that and be able to produce the report that you need, right? Without having to spend time learning the system and doing it yourself.
Interesting. Torbjorn, that is a fascinating aspect, because I've got to believe that when you're doing something in a repetitive manner, that's also where you make mistakes.
Absolutely, yeah. The thick fingering problem, right? You automate it in your physiognomy, and it's bound to just be wrong sometimes. And so I'm 100% with Buu-Ling here. What the controls of what the data is, right? That is the strength. So the data that we have available to us in an ecosystem of multiple business applications, it's massive. And to have that control of that data and to create an auditable kind of record of what has happened is huge. So the automation, a lot of the automation already exists, and at DATABASICS, at least, we don't call it AI. Those are policies, right? Rule-based matching, lookups, threshold triggers. These are things that have always existed in expense reporting, but to control that process, that is where the strength of AI comes in. And so the value add is actually freeing up, again, what in my mind I think of as like taking the administrative burden off, so that our customers, our partners, can focus on advancing the mission of their organization. That's where the real value lies.
Yeah, that's a great comment, because I think sometimes you get so bogged down by the task and the things that you have to do, you don't have time to think. And thinking is like underrated in the nonprofit sector, because we're always reacting, right?
Yeah,
which is such a problem. It's such a problem. Just giving ourselves the opportunity to create a little bit more time every day to think. That to me is just like a gift. Maybe I'm just reflecting my own life. You know?
No, that's the strategic advantage, right? Is that now you can focus on the mission. You have to control the process, right? We can't let the machine control. So the control has to still be there, but you can take some of those repetitive tasks out of your workday, and then you can focus on the strategy, then you can focus on the mission, and then you can become a value, you can add value even if you're in the finance side of things. So it's huge for us.
It's really great. And I also think too, the way you just phrased that was so beautiful, because I think a lot of times the finance people are like, they're the ones in the back room. They don't always communicate with the rest of the team. Sometimes there's contentious, attitudes between the two, or, development and finance, or operations and finance. And so I think this probably ultimately will help those teams gain more parity with the rest of the organization. I don't know if you see that or not, but again, it kind of, for me, it goes back to thinking time.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I think that technology is important, but I think if you're talking about in terms of collaborations and among the different teams, that's always important, regardless of where AI stands, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's I think there the human element. I've always referred to the human elements, right, in what we do. We're talking about technology here, but the human elements is like super important. And could AI technology help? Absolutely. There's tons of tools. We're talking about expense management, which is a tool, helps with that collaborations, right? And I actually absolutely agree that technology, AI, is there to help with that collaboration. And I also feel like that human elements is super important. That collaboration is super important. So much of that, what we do. And and honestly, what I see a lot is there's just not enough of that collaboration. We're human species. We want to, we should be, we want to, and we should be collaborating. We should be talking to people. And yet you'll be surprised that the engagement sometimes is just not there, I can just share with you like tons and tons of examples where, you can see examples of where there's just not enough of that engagement,
Right. Torbjorn, it's really an interesting aspect, because we're talking about the technology adapting a new way of thinking, of processing. I want to kind of pick your brain a little bit about how we analyze this data and these surface insights, and we save time. But then where does that information go? It seems to me to kind of tack on to what Buu-Ling just said. We got to be sharing this or explaining this to the rest of our organization. And I think sometimes that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and sometimes it's because it's so difficult to communicate this. So as Buu-Ling was saying, if we have a natural language query way for you to create a report, then this report is going to make sense to the reader as well. And sharing that report then has more impact. So it no longer becomes, this is what I have to do. And the reader kind of says, oh, great, I got the report from Torbjorn again, and it's going to say the same thing as last week. And actually, by using AI, what we are doing is we are actually using the intelligence, the artificial intelligence that we are talking about here. And that report is going to give insight that you may not have thought of yourself, right? So just engaging with AI in a productive way in making a report easy to create and distribute, it can give insights that you haven't thought about because you have been doing the same job forever. And now you have a new pair of eyes looking at this data and making analysis that you may not have thought of making yourself.
Yeah, that's like super powerful. Buu-Ling, are you finding that clients that are using this type of technology are, to tag on to what Torbjorn said, surprised, or they're getting new insights? It's not just the
Um,
same old report.
I think the technology, as I said, is still very new. Um, I think that I think that yes, getting the information from report is great. I also, just to step away a little bit to just to see, just to think about, sort of where AI can help. Um, and I don't know if this may be down the road or something, but um, people don't want to run reports sometimes, like they don't want to look at reports. They just want to know where am I with, how much are we spending in terms of supplies? Just tell me for the year, like how, those type of analysis, and they just want information, I think, like to feed to me, right? So that
Right.
I have a questions. And so where I can see sort of a path for this would be, to be able to ask questions in English and, provide that insight, instead of looking at a report and trying to figure out the numbers, right?
Right.
Is to respond to those, questions that tells me at the end of the day, oh, okay, this is where we are. This is how much we've spent on the conference, or and how do we spend more than last year, and how much of that percentage, right? We don't need to see like the entire report. I think that report it has its place, but I think especially for the non-finance people who may be interacting with the system, they're not going to want to just sit down and look at a report. What they have specific questions that they're looking for, and they're looking for the system to give it to them without learning the system. I just have to tell it what I want, and it feeds me back with the answer.
It's really interesting, isn't it, Torbjorn? Because to me, it seems like it goes back to your original comment, and that is building in time to think.
No, exactly, and to just have that assistant, right? That's we talk of AI as an assistant. It's your AI assistant, and to have that assistant kind of do the grunt work, and show, and maybe without even prompting, show the anomalies, shows where there is a spend drift, show where a fund code is absorbing costs that it shouldn't absorb, show where one individual expense may make sense, but now we see across the year, we're seeing a pattern, and that pattern is not good. This is the power of AI, and this is where we feel that we can really help our customers leverage AI and bring value to the table and make their lives easier and make them look good, frankly, right? Because they are now being stewards.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right. I mean, in the nonprofit sector, that's what it's about for so many of us. And we have to step forward and say, we're good stewards of these investments, and we're being thoughtful, and we're navigating this. Well, the two of you have been great. It's been really an interesting conversation. And I've loved having both of you on. Buu-Ling Tran, she's the Senior Vice President of Financial Solutions at JMT Consulting. Torbjorn Nilsen has come to us from DATABASICS, where he's the Director of Business Solutions. Really an interesting conversation that's in its infancy in so many ways. I think the takeaway for me was learning to recognize using this tool, Torbjorn, your great word, assistant, and assisting you in what really matters, so that you can then be more proactive and be more thoughtful and strategic. A great conversation. I think it's going to be one of those conversations that we have again and again as this technology is changing. And we're delighted that both of you would join us today on the Nonprofit Show. We have amazing sponsors that help us have these types of conversations that we've had today with Buu-Ling Tran and Torbjorn Nilsen. They include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, Your Part-Time Controller, Third Sector Company, our friends over at JMT Consulting, and Intuit QuickBooks. These are the folks that make a difference in our lives each and every day. As we end this episode of the Nonprofit Show, we remind you, we remind ourselves, our viewers, and our guests to stay well so you can do well.